Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Gemology for Schmucks. My name is Peter Nelson. I'm here to guide you in everything you need to know about gemstones and jewelry. Today's episode is brought to you by the color green. Sort of. The fact is, I have a couple of extra green stones on hand, and it's one that's becoming much more popular these days, so the price is rising. But it's not emerald. So let me introduce you to this green stone. First, we're going to test it and look at some of its properties. I'm going to talk about what it is and why it's an important stone for you to consider. Now, spoiler alert, it's not emerald. Emerald is one of the big three or big four if you like to talk about diamonds. I don't. And throughout history, green has been one of the most important colors to ever exist. In fact, our eyes are adapted to see green with more minutia than almost any other color. And that's even including red and blue. If you think about it, we've got blood and water, but green tends to be associated with food and life. So if you can find green out in nature, you're probably going to find water as well. So humans have an intimate connection with the color green. It's not going anywhere. And historically, many things that were called emerald would not be called emerald today in gemology, because we can now distinguish between several different types of green stones. So enough of the yakety-yak for now, let's check it out first. Of course, I love the Polaroscope, so we're going to start there. Now you'll notice that as we rotate the stone around, it's not blinking at all. And I can go through each of these three stones, and none of them are going to blink. I know because I've tested them prior. Let's take another look though. Yep, still not blinking. So the first thing that we know about this stone is that it is not doubly refractive. It's singly refractive. If it doesn't split light, it's not going to blink. So we have a singly refractive stone. Therefore, it definitely cannot be emerald. So let's move on to our next piece of information, the refractometer. We've got it on hand, nice and easy. Now, if I look at each of these stones individually, I can see that it has a rich green color and a bright luster. The bright luster leads me to believe that its refractive index is going to be on the higher side. If it has more of a gray luster, then it's going to have a medium or low refractive index. Emeralds, for example, do not have a particularly high refractive index. So one of the advantages of this stone is that it has a brighter luster. But let's find out exactly what is this Ri. Wiping it off, taking the smallest amount of refractometer liquid possible, both because it stinks and because it's expensive. And let's check our first stone. Now I can rotate my polarizing filter all I want, it's not going to blink. We already checked it in the Polaroscope. Force a habit. Rotate it, just to make sure. And what I'm seeing is 1.74. Keep that in mind. I don't have a piece of paper around. But the nice thing is, because it's not splitting light, it's not doubly refractive, we don't have to worry about birefringence, that distance between the ordinary and extraordinary rays. Let's check another stone. Now this one is a little bit lighter in color, less intense, so we might find a different refractive index. Sometimes with more intensely colored stones, we get a little extra oomph, but let's see. Nope, this one's 1.74 as well. And let's do the final one, just for kicks and giggles. Well, that's thoroughly unexciting. It's still 1.74. So let's clean it off. Make sure we clean off our refractometer as well. If not, that liquid crystallizes and can scratch the glass. Terrible time. Makes it more difficult to read. It's already challenging enough. So we had a good reason to believe that it would be a higher refractive index, and it was. 1.74 is quite high. This liquid can only read up to 1.81. For an example, corundum, ruby and sapphire is 1.76, 1.77. So we're pretty much up at the top end of what we can read with refractometer. And it's worth noting at this point that emerald has a refractive index of about 1.56 to 1.58, depending on the coloration. That's a significant difference between 1.74. So if we had two stones right next to each other, this stone that we're talking about and emerald would have a much more gray luster, and this stone would have a much brighter luster. So let me go ahead and tell you that 1.74 is a nice healthy range for a couple of different stones. But without going through all the diagnostics, I'll go ahead and tell you that this is grossular garnet. Grossular garnet is one of the two families of garnets. Pyrospite being over here, spessartine, pyrope, a lot of the garnets that you already know. And then this family over here has demantoid garnet, otherwise known as andradite, and grossular. Now, grossular has several different names inside of it based on the colors. In fact, grossular can even be colorless. No color at all. Because grossular, unlike spessartite, is not idiochromatic, it's allochromatic. Spessartite will always be some color of orange or brown or closer to reddish, depending on how it mixes with the other cousin minerals. This particular green is known as Savverite. Savverite was first discovered in Zimbabwe in Africa, but the name itself, Tsavorite, is after the Tsavo National Park in Kenya. The name was chosen together with the original discoverer of the gem, Campbell Bridges, alongside the leader of Tiffany & Company at the time. Yes, that's the same Tiffany & Company that we all know and love. Interesting how powerful people get to choose the names. JP Morgan? Morganite? But in fact, there are several nations that have these green garnets, Savverites. Kenya has in Tsavo National Park, as well as Tanzania has on the other side in the shadow of mighty Kilimanjaro. And of course, all the way down into Zimbabwe. One of the largest Savverites to date is actually called the Lion of Merelani. And I believe it's over 100 carats. Merelani being the Merelani Hills in Tanzania. And that, in fact, also is the Tanzanite mining tract. Ooh, the plot thickens. Another type of grossular garnet that some may have heard of is called Hessonite. Hessonite is more of a honey-colored stone, and some people mix it up with spessartite. But unlike spessartite, grossular garnet does not have that diagnostic spectrum. So if you're confident using your spectroscope, which I talk about a lot on this channel, if you haven't seen that video, then you definitely should. But in this situation, the spectroscope is not going to help us. But one thing that can help us that doesn't usually is UV light. Unlike some of the garnets over in the pyrospite family, Savverite garnet does fluoresce. I haven't inspected Hessonite, so I won't speak about that one, but Savverite definitely does. One thing to remind ourselves about UV in this case is that there is long and shortwave UV. Most of these torches put out long-wave UV, but for Savverite, what you're going to want to be looking for is shortwave UV. Some torches are sold with shortwave UV. Be careful, it is dangerous. And one of the safer options would be to have one of the boxes that keeps the stones dark as well as shielding you from light. They have long-wave and short-wave UV typically. And one thing that I was shocked by when I was checking these stones is that the more intensely colored stone actually fluoresced less than the lighter colored stones. So this is a situation where your UV torch, once again, should be a part of everyday carry, but also I like to complain about the Chelsea filter because it's so popular and so underusable, but in this situation, it is actually useful. So if you don't have UV on hand, you can use your Chelsea filter to give it a quick inspection, especially if you're looking at multiple stones at the same time. This fluorescence is not something that you find in many stones. Emeralds will have fluorescence, depending on which region they're from, because some of them are more high on iron, which quenches the fluorescence, but these Savverite garnets all fluoresce to some degree. Again, as I said, the lighter stones actually fluoresced more in this sample. And that can be very useful for you if you're trying to make sure that you're not being given a piece of glass. Because we said it was singly refractive, right? In the Polaroscope, how would I know the difference between a piece of glass that's been faceted and a piece of Savverite? Well, that fluorescence would be a strong indicator, especially if you don't have access to a refractometer to test its refractive index. One thing that is typical for buyers also is to have a reference stone. If I was going out into the bush and trying to buy Savverite, if they were already cut, how would I be able to distinguish between natural and maybe glass or something like synthetic spinel? UV is super useful, and then that reference stone can help me to gauge the luster. Something like glass will typically have a much lower luster, unless it's lead glass. But if they're just breaking a Heineken bottle and faceting that, they're not controlling the chemical constitution of that glass, so the chances of it fluorescing are next to zero. Though I should really test that. That'll be a project for a different day. So one of the reasons that I think that Savverite garnet is an excellent stone for you to consider is because Savverite garnet is much tougher than emerald. Emerald is relatively hard, being beryl. The Mohs hardness is about an 8, so it doesn't scratch readily, but most emeralds do have fissures running through them. So the clarity is lower, and those fissures are points of weakness. It's very common for emeralds to break when they are being set. That's why it scares people like me. Because while I love the color of emerald, there are colors that only exist in emerald I haven't seen in any other stones. Certainly not the same color as Savverite, and some of those colors will also overlap with Savverite. But that toughness is a real problem if you spend significant amounts of money on an emerald, because they are typically more expensive than Savverite. I want to make sure that my value is protected. If the setter goes and breaks my 1 carat or 5 carat, 10 carat emerald, even if I recut those 2 pieces, it's not worth anywhere near the same amount as that 1 emerald was whole. Savverite, that's much less of a concern. So while its relative hardness might be a little bit lower than emerald, it's not by much. And we also have a much higher clarity. While loop clean stones are still extremely rare, they tend to be clearer crystals on average. So you get a lot of sparkle, great green color, and a more robust stone. And at this point in history, the price of Savverite, even for a given size, tends to be lower than emerald. Now, this is something that I do anticipate changing over the next number of years. So when my clients come to me asking for an emerald, I ask them if they have their heart set on emerald or if their heart is set on a natural green stone. Because if it's a natural green stone, why not consider this? In my view, this is better value unless you are going for specific colors or emerald for the sake of emerald. If you're just going for a green stone, this in many situations is better than an emerald. So let me know what you think. The reason I had these on hand is because I'm working on a jewelry project with one of my clients, and we had this exact same conversation. They contacted me through gemshepherd.com, and that's when we started talking about which stone might be the best fit for them, for their budget range, and for the appearance, and for protecting value. And now we'll be going on to make the jewelry. One other thing that's important to note is that Savverite does not have any true synthetics. There are simulants, such as the glass that we talked about, but no true synthetics that would test in the same way, fluorescence, RI, etc. Whereas emerald has several different synthetics, as well as simulants. And these synthetics are really cool and interesting, but they're not natural stones. So it makes it much more complicated to distinguish emerald as opposed to Savverite. Once you know that it's grossular garnet, your identification is done. And particularly in private transactions, if you don't have a third-party lab anywhere nearby, it's a lot easier to trade in grossular garnet, Savverite. And for the rest of you, leave me a comment down below, hit like, hit subscribe if you haven't already, tell all your friends about me, and until next time, bye-bye.